There was a time in Canada when we did have governments of all persuasion for a while who took it for granted that a healthy democracy was one that had increasing equality, not increasing inequality, and it had a strong and vital trade union movement in the private sector and in the public sector. That's what we had at one time. But that, regrettably, is no longer the case. Now, last year, the Broadbent Institute, the new organization that I happen to chair right now, published 2 discussion papers. The first focused on the causes of rising economic inequality and what approaches governments should take to make a difference. The second subject of our publications in the past year was on the very important subject of trade unions. And the link by our institution between the two is very important indeed. Starting from about 1980, here in Canada, we've seen a steady rise in the income share of the top 1% in the country. Most of you will be very familiar with this. It increased from 8% in 1980, that is 1% having 8% of the income, to the most recent figure when the top 1% had fully 14% of the income. This means that for every dollar, for about $1 in every $7 rather of income in Canada, now that goes to the top 1%, whose incomes start at about $235,000 a year. And not only do the rich in Canada have the greatest share of wealth they've had since the 1920s, right? Get that. The top 1% have more money coming in now than they've had for any time since the 1920s. But also, in the most recent years, the increases in that share have been by far the greatest, while income is growing across society as a whole, and in fact, for the majority of income earners, their income has not been going up at all. It's remained stagnant. This is why, in my view, the Occupy movement was entirely right to protest the fact that a large and rising share, absolutely right, in protesting that this large and growing share of income has been going to a very tiny elite, consisting mainly of corporate executives, while middle and lower class living standards have stagnated or actually fallen back. In a democracy committed to the principle that everyone should have an equal chance in life, this is simply wrong. It's not, as I said a minute ago, the way Canada used to function. Not at all coincidentally, the early 1980s not only marked the beginning of higher inequality in Canada, it also began the downturn in union strength. 1980 was the high point for the percentage of the workforce in trade unions. Since then, the overall unionization rate in Canada has fallen from a high of 40% of workers to just a bit over 30%, driven by a fall in the private sector. Unionization has dropped from 30% to under 20%. Only 1 out of 5 Canadian workers in the private sector is now in a union, and it's going down. As union density has fallen, so has the bargaining power and political influence of the labor movement. Unions were absolutely pivotal actors in the era of shared prosperity and growing equality, which lasted from the post-war period until the early 1980s. The period I came to maturity in, when I was going to university in the 1950s. That glorious period, and we look back now from the 1950s to up to around 1980, we were growing together, wealth was being produced, it was being increasingly shared on the basis of equality, and the crucial aspect that was making this happen was the growth in the trade union movement itself during that period. It's no exaggeration to say that unions were the principal cause of the emergent middle class in Canada. It was the militancy and organizational muscle of the unions that ensured wages kept in line with economic growth. There should be no illusion about this. And I want to stress, this was not just for their own members. Income differences narrowed considerably from the 1950s through the 1970s, as the gains made by unionized workers spread to non-union workers, including in particular, of course, many in low-paid jobs. Let me again make a personal observation here. I was born in 1936. You can do the math, figure out I'm just over 50 now. Born in 1930, marginally over 50. And the first edition of the Canadian Encyclopedia Canadiana said I was actually on the picket line in 1937 when the local 222 was formed. Well, I was a pretty active one-year-old, if that was the case. But I can tell you someone, I have an uncle. I have several uncles. My grandmother said I won in 1968 because most of the family who had voted Tory or Liberal up to that voted for me. So for good conservative reasons, I got elected. They voted for someone in the family. But I can't let an occasion go by with me just to leave rather dry words about the militancy that produced the changes, not only for people who became members of unions, but for all those who got the benefits because of the existence of unions. And I have my favorite uncle will be turning 100 next February. He went moose hunting last year. He went moose hunting last year. Some from Oshawa may know him. His first name is Aubrey. He's known as Curly. But as a very young man, he was on that picket line in 1937 when the union was born. And it's a very proud moment in my family history that I always mention, by the way, to my students. So I take very seriously what I've just said here about the militancy that played such a crucial role in the formation of unions across Canada and the benefits it brought to members, but also to others. And it wouldn't have happened if men and women hadn't had exceptional courage to go against all the norms and traditions up to that point. And I want to stress that. Thank you. Tight question here. It's also important, I want to mention, that the gains of unions went well beyond higher wages and benefits. They were of fundamental importance, of course. But unions gave workers some power in the workplace compared to management, marking a small step towards democratic citizenship at work. Increasingly, matters that had always been seen as so-called management prerogatives came up for bargaining. And that meant they came up for democratic accountability and input by workers themselves. Unions also became important political actors, working through political parties, especially, but not, I regret to say, not exclusively through the CCF and the NDP, but primarily through the history of our country, through the CCF and the NDP. And they did it politically to advance public pensions, public health care, unemployment insurance, affordable housing, widely accessible post-secondary education, and other key building blocks of what came to be called the welfare state in Canada. Indeed, in 1961, the labor movement was one of the founding partners in the creation of the NDP. It wasn't just a supporter of the NDP after through the CLC, through the leadership of the trade union movement at that time. I repeat, the trade union movement was part of the founding of the party itself. It was a key instrument in bringing into being the new Democratic Party of Canada. It was through political action that union rights, the right to union recognition, the right to free collective bargaining, and the right to strike were entrenched in all the key human rights conventions in the post-war period. These rights were ratified by Canada with the agreement of the provinces in 1976 and became rightly seen as an integral part of our idea of what democracy itself means. I can't emphasize that too much. The right to a union is in every provision. There are three components to the international human rights law. There's a Universal Declaration, there's a Covenant on Political and Civil Rights, and there's a Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And the only right that's in all three is the right to a union. The only right. And I'm also proud to say, as a Canadian, something that's not widely known, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was written by a Canadian. A man named John Humphrey from the province of New Brunswick and then of the law school at McGill, became an advisor to Eleanor Roosevelt down in the newly established United Nations in New York. And he, a Canadian, wrote the first draft of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and central in the requirements of that declaration was the right to a trade union. John Humphrey himself said in his autobiography after this that these rights, the social and economic rights, were the key rights. Political and civil rights are certainly very important, but he said for ordinary working families, the right to a pension, the right to a housing actually, the right to go to school, without such rights, the other political and civil rights in the daily lives of workers wouldn't mean an awful lot. So he put it in context, and again I emphasize this was a Canadian that was instrumental in providing this international law, which we signed on to as a nation in 1976. I want to talk about two important ways that we as a country can promote greater equality, because that's the theme I'm trying to address here. First, unions directly through their work, narrow the pay differences and reduce the proportion of low-wage jobs. Hence, there's more equality in incomes for all Canadians. Second, the labor movement has supported economic and social rights, as I've just said, like pensions, health care, and education for all workers. They have promoted these public services that provide benefits to citizens paid through progressive taxes, so access to them doesn't depend on personal income. Hence, there's more equality again. It doesn't matter what your income is. We have a universal health care program. All citizens, no matter where they are in the income scale, have it as a right. So through their political action, the trade union movement has fought to get such rights for all citizens, and thus contributing more to equality. Social Democrats understand that it's hard to redistribute income to achieve greater equality if income earned from the market is highly unequal to begin with. So we would have to work on trying to bring down the gap in workers in the first place before governments attempt to redistribute. Countries like Sweden are much more equal than Canada, not just because of higher levels of social spending, but also because the labor movement has represented the vast majority of employees in Sweden and has deliberately tried to narrow wage and salary differences as part of their national bargaining. When everyone virtually is in the trade union movement, as it is in Sweden, it's much easier for the unions to collaborate to narrow the gap that's being paid to workers in different sectors of the economy. Strong public and private sector unions here in Europe have also taken the lead in bargaining for pay equity for women and racialized groups, thus again serving the democratic cause of greater equality. Political scientists have long recognized that a major reason why the Canadian labor movement remains stronger than in the US is our stronger tradition of social unionism. The belief that unions have to speak for and fight for the interests of concern for all workers, and not just in the workplace, but also, as I have emphasized, for public goods in the political sphere. The truth is that the NDP here in Canada has supported labor rights much more consistently than has the Democratic Party in the USA. And that is one of the reasons that we do have a stronger trade union movement. Let me just conclude with mentioning some challenges. The Canadian, Canadian labor faces some fundamental challenges today, including falling trade union density, as I've mentioned, and an overt attack on union rights by right-wing governments, like the Harper government here in Ottawa. It's out to undermine the right to a union, out to undermine the use of union rights once you get a union, and it's being followed by a number of provincial governments across this country right now. And the point I want to make on this is it's not only undermining union rights, it's undermining our very idea of democracy. In countering this attack, it's vital that unions build membership and bargaining power among workers, especially among the many lower paid and insecure workers in the private service sector who lack access to the benefits and protections of a union. More unions got to be established. More workers have to be brought in. So those that are already in the trade union movement have got to get out and do what they can to organize more workers, just as my uncle and many people did back in the 1930s that gave birth to the trade union movement in the first place. And having said that, I've been delighted to see the Canadian Labour Congress and the new union, Unifor, have committed themselves to taking on this task at this time. It's also encouraging that the labor movement continues to campaign for the interests of all working people in the political domain, as in the current fight for better public pensions for everyone and for higher minimum wages for workers. Again, both of these goals are essential to building a more equal Canada. And talking to a group of pensioners, some of whom are older than I am, in this room, I don't want to joke on this point, there can't be a more serious matter of public policy, not for you to think of your own generation now, but for you to think of those 10 years younger, 20 years younger, 40 years younger than yourselves, than to fight to double the Canada Pension Plan for all Canadians in the future. I conclude with this. A strong and progressive labor movement was crucial to the creation of the middle class in Canada in the first place. Rebuilding the movement will be equally pivotal to the major task of reversing the trend to greater inequality today. And as a Canadian who's benefited from the presence of unions, I want to say this: we need both a more equal Canada and strong unions, and they both go hand in hand. Thank you very much.